There is a dock at Alpena, Michigan, that does not exist anymore. It stood on the south bank of the Thunder Bay River, where the river softens into the lake. In the autumn of 1902, that single stretch of pine planking was one of the busiest lumber-loading berths in the United States. Schooners queued in the channel, waiting their turn. Tugboats coughed black smoke against a sky the color of slate. The air smelled of fresh sap, wet rope, coal smoke, and, on the wind off the lake, something colder underneath it all, the metallic mineral breath of Lake Huron in November. Picture yourself standing on that dock at dusk. The lamp at the end of the pier has just been lit. It throws a small yellow circle onto the boards at your feet. Beyond that circle, the world is already going dark. You can hear water lapping against pilings. You can hear chain shifting somewhere to your left, a slow iron sound that has no hurry in it. You can hear the creak of a hull working at anchor, wood under load, rope under strain, a vessel breathing the way only a wooden vessel breathes. The schooner tied off at the end of that dock was called the Bay City. She was 146 feet long. She was old, and before the year was out, she would be on the bottom of Thunder Bay, driven onto the dock she had come to load from, in a sudden south wind that her captain saw rising and could do nothing about. This is where our story begins. Not in a storm, not in a courtroom, not in a headline. It begins on a quiet wooden pier, on an ordinary working evening, in a town that, in 1902, fed the building of an entire nation. Because the truth of what happened to the men who sailed these ships in that year does not begin with the wrecks. It begins with the dock. It begins with the lamp. It begins with the simple fact that on this evening, in this port, in this year, the people in charge of these vessels had every reason to know better, and chose, instead, to send them out. Alpena in 1902 was not a sleepy place. It was an industrial machine. Sawmills lined both banks of the river, their steam stacks running day and night. The forests of northern Michigan had been falling for 60 years by then, dragged by oxen and river drive to mills like these, sawn into board feet, stacked on docks, and loaded into wooden ships. By 1880, Michigan was already producing more lumber than any other state in the country. By the early 1900s, on Lake Michigan alone, more than 2,000 sailing ships were registered at local ports. A great many of them were lumber carriers. A great many of those lumber carriers were old. If you were to walk that dock tonight, you would not find it. The mills are gone. The booms are gone. The schooners are gone. What is left is a quiet stretch of riverbank, a few historical markers, and the lake, the same lake, with the same wind, in the same month, still doing what it has always done. But on the night I am asking you to imagine, the dock was alive. Tied to its outermost bollard, with her bow pointed into the channel, was the Bay City. 3 masts, wooden hull, a working boat, the kind of vessel the Great Lakes had been building since the 1840s. In her hold, lumber. On her deck, more lumber, stacked high, lashed down with chain, because there was always more lumber than hold to put it in. Her crew were men in heavy wool coats and oil-stained caps. None of them were rich. Most of them were paid by the trip, not by the hour, which meant that the ship lying still at a dock paid no one anything. And so the Bay City, like every vessel of her kind, lived by one rule above all others: keep moving. There is a phrase the men who worked these waters used among themselves, quietly, when the owners were not listening. They called certain ships coffin ships. It was not poetic. It was working language. It meant a vessel that everyone who knew her had stopped trusting. A hull that had been patched, repatched, re-rigged, redecked, recorked, and sent out again because she still floated. And because, on paper, she was still rated to sail. That phrase was not invented for the lakes. It came across the Atlantic from the British coal trade of the 1860s and 1870s, where overloaded, underinsured, decaying merchant ships were sent out to sink so the owners could collect the insurance money. In Britain, that scandal was so visible that Parliament eventually wrote a line of paint into the law. They called it the Plimsoll line, a white mark on the hull that told every harbour master in the world how deep a vessel could legally sit in the water. The Plimsoll line was law in British shipping from 1876. It was not law on the Great Lakes in 1902. It would not be law on the Great Lakes for many decades after. There was no equivalent on the lakes. There was no painted line. There was no harbour master who could refuse a deck load. There were captains and owners and lumber buyers and weather, and that was all. A maritime archaeologist with the Wisconsin Historical Society, Tamara Thompson, has put it plainly in the historical record. She has described how decrepit schooners, vessels that the established Lake Erie trade no longer trusted, were moved to Wisconsin and patched up, and how the working theory of the men who owned them was that the lumber cargo itself, packed into the hold and stacked on deck, would buoy the ship up enough to keep her from sinking. Especially with green lumber, she has added, that was not the case. These were the ships. These were the ships that carried the boards that built Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, and Detroit. These were the ships that turned a Michigan forest into a row of Midwestern houses. These were the ships that made certain men, in certain panelled offices in Muskegon and Saginaw and Bay City, very wealthy. Those men in those offices were not on the Bay City tonight. The men on the Bay City tonight were the ones whose names you would never hear again unless something went wrong. Picture the deck of that schooner now. The lumber is loaded. The hold is full, and the deck is full above it, board on board on board, lashed with chain that bites into the soft pine and leaves marks the men later call toothprints. The freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the deck edge, is small, smaller than it should be, smaller than any saltwater port in the world would have permitted in 1902. The wind that night came up out of the south. The records show it. The wind off Thunder Bay, when it turns south and steady, drives water up against the Alpena docks and pushes anchored vessels hard against their lines. The Bay City was at anchor, waiting. Her chain paid out across the bottom of the bay. She walked sideways toward the lumber dock she had come to load from. Then she stopped walking and started slamming. Wood against wood, hull against pier, again and again. She went down in shallow water, in sight of the town, in sight of the lamp at the end of the pier. There were no headlines that night. The Bay City was one schooner among hundreds. Her loss was a paragraph in a marine record, a line in an insurance ledger, a shrug at the next table over in the captain's bar on Water Street. These things, in 1902, happened all the time. A clerk in an underwriter's office in Cleveland turned a page, dipped a pen, and wrote the next name on the next manifest. The lamp at the end of the dock did not know. It threw its small yellow circle onto the boards. It waited for the next ship. There would always be a next ship. The lumber was still bleeding when they loaded it. That is not a metaphor. Pine, freshly cut, weeps. It runs sap from the cut ends, clear at first, then amber, then sticky against the palm of a man's hand. In a Michigan sawmill in 1902, a board pulled off the saw and stacked on the dock that same afternoon was, in the language of the trade, green. It had not been seasoned. It had not been kiln-dried. It had not had the years of slow air curing that a builder in Cleveland or Buffalo would, eventually, demand of it. It was simply tree, 3 days ago, and lumber, now, and money by Friday. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the loading boom. Mill workers throw boards down a wooden slide that runs from the sawmill floor to the dock. The boards land in a stack. The stack rises. 2 men in heavy gloves square it, knock the loose ones into line, and shout up to the next man. The boards are wet. There are dark patches on the pine where the sap has not yet dried. When you put your hand on a board, your hand comes away tacky. The whole dock smells of resin, and under the resin, of the lake. There is no romance to it. It is just the smell of a place where wood is becoming cargo. Now look at the schooner waiting to receive it. Her hatches are open. Her hold is a long, dark wooden room running almost the length of the ship. The men with the cant, hooks, and the deck winches lower the boards in by the bundle, and other men, working below in lantern light, stack them, bottom up, side to side, end to end. The work is brutal. The hold is hot in summer and freezing in November, and the air down there, when the lumber is green, is thick with the smell of the wet pine. Sweet, almost sugary, but trapping. A man working a full shift in a green lumber hold would come back up onto the deck looking pale. When the hold was full, they kept loading. This is the part that matters. This is where the story turns. A Great Lakes lumber schooner of 1902 was not loaded the way an ocean cargo ship was loaded. On the ocean, there was the Plimsoll line. On the lakes, there was nothing. So when the hold was full, they stacked lumber on the deck. 6 feet high, 8 feet high, in some cases 10 feet high. A pine wall running almost the full length of the ship, lashed down with chain, that the men, when they hauled it tight, could feel sinking into the wet wood beneath them. If you were to walk that deck tonight, you would have to walk it sideways. There would be a narrow lane, perhaps 2 feet wide, between the deck load and the rail. You would duck under the boom. You would step over coiled rope. You would pass the deck pump, the hand pump every wooden ship of the period carried, because every wooden ship of the period leaked. And you would understand, without anyone needing to tell you, that this vessel was no longer a ship with cargo on it. This vessel was a stack of lumber with a hull underneath. The men who owned these vessels had a working theory about why this was acceptable. The theory was that the lumber would save the ship. It went like this. If a wooden schooner, packed full of lumber and stacked high above the deck, ever foundered in a sea, the wood itself would float. The cargo would buoy the hull. The vessel might wallow. The vessel might list. But she would not sink, because she was, in effect, a giant block of wood inside another giant block of wood. The pine would hold her up. This theory has its own paper trail. The Wisconsin Historical Society, in the records it keeps of the state's shipwreck heritage, describes it directly. Lumber, the historians write, was a popular cargo for aged schooners, because the lumber was not easily damaged by water in leaky vessels, and because the inherent buoyancy of the cargo perhaps helped many old leaky vessels make port in a raging Lake Michigan storm. That was the working logic. That was why the captains of small share lumber operations bought, in the words of the same historical record, the least expensive aged schooners and wrung the last bit of life and profit out of them in the lumber trade. It worked sometimes. That is the dangerous part. It worked often enough that the men who owned the ships could point to 100 safe arrivals for every disappearance. It worked often enough that the doctrine became a defense. It worked often enough that no one in any state legislature ever felt compelled to write a line of paint into a Great Lakes hull. But it failed in a way that the figures alone cannot quite show you. It failed quietly. It failed slowly. It failed mostly in November, on overnight runs, far from any life-saving station, with no one watching except the boy at the wheel. Tamara Thompson of the Wisconsin Historical Society has spoken to this directly. The lumber buoyancy theory, she has said, was simply not the case, especially with green lumber. Green lumber, freshly cut, full of sap and water, behaves nothing like the seasoned dry pine of a builder's yard. Green lumber absorbs water. Green lumber takes on weight. Green lumber, soaked through, sits lower in the water with every hour that passes. Green lumber, in November, on Lake Huron, in a south wind, does not save a ship. Green lumber drowns her slowly. The men who sailed these vessels knew this. The men who owned them did too. The difference was that the men who sailed them were on board. There is a journal entry from a Great Lakes lumber captain that survives in the archive. The schooner was the La Petite. The captain was Oscar B. Smith. The vessel was small by the standards of the trade, 119 feet long, a draft of just over 8 feet. On the 12th of September, 1876, he wrote a single sentence into his log. Left Alpena with 180,000 feet of lumber last evening. 180,000 board feet. A board foot is a piece of wood 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch thick. Stack them, and they are, in volume, the size of a small house. Captain Smith was not boasting. He was simply recording. 2 years later, in another entry, he noted he had finished loading at Alpena and had by far the largest load I have ever had on, 201,000 board feet of lumber and lath. He recorded the freight rate, $1.25 per 1,000 board feet. The total, $251.25 for the trip. I want you to hold those numbers. $251. For a hull, a captain, a crew, the freight, the insurance, the risk, and the November lake. By 1880, the going freight rate from Muskegon to Chicago, the busiest lumber run on the Great Lakes, had dropped to $2 per 1,000 board feet. On a single August day in 1873, 136 sailing vessels arrived in Chicago laden with lumber. 136. In a single day. The economics of a Great Lakes lumber schooner did not allow for caution. Caution was an unaffordable luxury. A captain who sat at anchor for 3 days waiting for better weather was a captain whose owner did not invite him back. This was not whispered. This was the structure. Of all the men in whose offices the structure took its working shape, one name stood above the others. And that name still stands today, carved on libraries, parks, hospitals, schools, art galleries, athletic fields, and an entire city's civic memory in West Michigan. His name was Charles Henry Hackley. He was born in 1837 in Indiana. He arrived in Muskegon in 1856 at the age of 19 on the schooner Challenge with a few dollars in his pocket. He went to work as a laborer in a lumber yard the same afternoon. By 1859, he had bought into his first mill. By the 1880s, the firm of Hackley and Hume was cutting 30 million board feet of lumber a year, and the Hackley fleet of lumber schooners, which included, among many others, the Rouse Simmons, the Thomas Hume, and the C.H. Hackley, was making almost weekly runs between Grand Haven and Chicago. When Hackley died in February 1905, his estate was valued at roughly $18 million. In today's money, that is approximately $600 million. This is not by itself a charge against him. Charles Hackley was, by the standards of the philanthropy of his day, an extraordinarily generous man. The libraries and hospitals he funded still stand. His statue still sits on a bench in downtown Muskegon. His record of giving is real, and it is publicly admired. It is also true that the Thomas Hume, one of his own ships, sailed from Chicago on the 21st of May, 1891, and was never seen again. 7 men were aboard. The wreck was not found until more than a century later. Hackley and Hume could not believe, when she failed to make port, that a vessel of theirs could be overcome by water. They sent another captain to look for her. Nothing was found, then, of the 7 men. These were the conditions of the trade. The owners, when they lost a ship, lost the ship. The owners, when they lost a crew, lost the next paragraph in a newspaper column. There is no record I can find that Charles Hackley was ever asked, in any public forum, why the ships of his fleet were what they were and were loaded as they were. No such forum existed. The not asking was the structure. There was another archetype. The historian John Jensen, in published interviews on Great Lakes maritime history, has called the shipping magnate James Corrigan the poster child for the Gilded Age heartless capitalist. The phrase Corrigan operated by, the phrase that defined his fleet, was one more voyage, one more trip before the season closed, one more cargo before the ice came in. The Lucerne, one of Corrigan's schooners, went out for one more voyage with iron ore in November 1886. The lighthouse keeper at Chequamegon Bay found her the next morning by the sight of 3 masts standing out of the water. He went out with a hatchet and cut 3 of her crew free of the rigging, where they had frozen to death. The freight rates in late autumn were the highest of the year, and the man who refused that freight was a man who would not be in the trade much longer. The underwriters, in their ledgers, called certain hulls fully insured to value. It meant that if the vessel went down, the owner would be made whole. The cargo, insured separately, would be paid for by the buyer. The only people on the wrong side of the math, when a coffin ship went down, were the men aboard her. And the men aboard her were cheap. The Great Lakes shipping firms had a strong financial incentive. And, as the historical record states bluntly, no legislative reason, not to crew their vessels with the youngest, least experienced sailors they could find. A teenage wheelsman cost less than a man with 20 years on the lakes. A teenage deckhand could be replaced from the next dock the next morning. The captain of the Bannockburn, the steel-hulled freighter that disappeared on Lake Superior on the 21st of November, 1902, was 37. He was the oldest man on board. Most of his crew of 20 were aged 17 to 20. One of his two wheelsmen, the boy actually steering the ship through the night that swallowed her, was 16. We will come to him by name in the next chapter. For now, hold one image. The dock at Manistique, or Bay City, or Alpena, in the last week of October, 1902. Light going out of the sky early now. Wind off the lake with the smell of metal in it. A schooner is being loaded ahead of you. Her hold is full. Her deck is being stacked. 6 feet, 7 feet, 8 feet of green pine dripping sap onto the boards, lashed with chain. A man on the dock, older, grey at the temples, a captain himself once, stands with his hands in his coat pockets and watches her sit lower in the water with every bundle that comes aboard. He does not say anything. There is nothing to say. He has watched this for 30 years. The owner of that schooner is not on her. The buyer of that lumber is not on her. The clerk who wrote the manifest is not on her. The boy at the wheel is on her. He is 16. He has been at sea, on the lakes, for less than a year. He is paid by the trip. The lumber under his feet is still bleeding sap. The ship he is steering is still floating. For now, the year did not begin with a storm. It rarely does. Picture yourself standing on the cliffs above one of the lakes, any of them, it does not matter which, and watching the year 1902 go by below you. The ships move out of harbour in the morning. Some come back. Some do not. April. The ice broke early in 1902, and the schooners moved before the lakes were really ready to be moved on. On the 17th of April, a 148-foot wooden schooner, built in 1884, ran aground in the shallows off Harbour Beach on Lake Huron. There were no casualties. She was simply stranded, in clear sight of the town. From the breakwater, she looked almost peaceful. From the breakwater, she looked as though she might still be saved. She was not saved. She is the first ship of 1902 to be entered into the long ledger of vessels that the lake decided to keep. June. On the morning of the 7th of June, the steel-hulled steamer Thomas Wilson left Duluth Harbour in clear weather. A whaleback freighter, 10 years old, riveted steel hull, single propeller, loaded with iron ore from the Mesabi Range. The water was calm. The hatches had not yet been ordered closed. A second vessel, the wooden steamer George Hadley, was inbound for Duluth at the same moment. The harbour tug Annie L. Smith signalled the Hadley to divert to neighbouring Superior Harbour instead. The Hadley's captain made an immediate turn to port. He failed to signal. He failed to see the Wilson. The two collided just outside the harbour. The Hadley struck the Wilson just forward of the aft hatch. The Wilson rolled to port, righted, and then sank by the bow in 3 minutes. 9 of her 20-man crew went down with her. This was June. This was calm water. This was clear weather. This was in sight of the harbour. If this could happen here, you can imagine what was waiting in November. July. On the 24th of July, the wooden bulk freighter Henry J. Johnson went down on Lake Huron in fog off Spectacle Reef. She had collided with the Fred Pabst, an upbound steamer carrying coal. The Johnson was carrying iron ore from Escanaba to Cleveland. Her crew got off into the lifeboats and were picked up several hours later by a tug called the Parker and taken into Alpena. She is logged in the Great Lakes vessel histories under that date, that cargo, those circumstances. August through October. The lumber trade ran at full pace through the summer. The mills at Manistique, Bay City, Saginaw, and Alpena cleared their yards. The schooners moved in long, slow processions across Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, deck loaded with green pine, sitting low in the water. Freight rates climbed steadily, the way they always did in the run-up to ice. There were small wrecks through the season. The wooden bulk freighter Robert Wallace, lost in 1902 on Lake Superior, only found again by sonar more than 100 years later, in 235 feet of water, with her bronze bell still attached to a wooden rail and engraved with her name. The scow schooner Dan Hayes, lost in 1902 on Lake Michigan. Her remains documented now only by underwater archaeology. These vessels are real. They are listed. They were not famous enough to make the front pages. November. November is the month the Great Lakes are remembered for. The sailors of these waters had a name for the storms that came down out of the Canadian prairies and across the lakes in the 11th month. They called them the November gales. They were not weather, in the ordinary sense. They were a season inside a season. They began in the first week of November and lasted on and off until the lakes froze. They could turn a calm afternoon into a 70-knot blizzard in the time it took a man to cross his own deck. The records of the life-saving stations along the shores, at Grand Marais, at Two Heart River, at Whitefish Point, at Vermilion, are heaviest in November. The bells rang most often in November. The bodies came ashore most often in November. In November of 1902, the gales came as they always came. Up at Alpena, on Lake Huron, the schooner Bay City, the one we stood beside in Chapter 1, the one tied to the lumber dock in the lamplight, dragged her anchor in a sudden south wind and slammed into the dock she had come to load from. She went down in shallow water in sight of the town. The marine record notes that the wind rose, the anchor dragged, the schooner was lost. And then, on the 21st of November, 1902, the lake took the Bannockburn. This is the wreck I asked you, in the last chapter, to hold in your mind. This is the boy at the wheel. The Bannockburn was a Canadian-registered steel-hulled freighter, 244 feet long, only 9 years old, almost new by the standards of the lakes. She belonged to the Montreal Transportation Company. On her final voyage, she carried 85,000 bushels of wheat, downbound from Fort William, the city now called Thunder Bay, Ontario, toward Georgian Bay. She left Fort William on the 20th of November. She suffered a slight grounding. The damage was inspected, judged minor, and her departure was delayed by a single day. She started again on the 21st. I tell you about her in a chapter about the wrecks of 1902, because the Bannockburn is what the trade looked like even when the cargo was not lumber. She was not an old, patched schooner. She was a modern vessel, and it did not save her. What killed the Bannockburn killed the lumber schooners too, because what killed the Bannockburn was not her hull. It was the system that loaded her, crewed her, scheduled her, and sent her into a Lake Superior November. The captain was George R. Wood, of Port Dalhousie, Ontario. 37 years old, the oldest man on the ship. The first mate, Alex Graham, was also from Port Dalhousie. The chief engineer, George Booth, was from Kingston, Ontario. Of the rest of the crew of 20, the records show that most were aged between 17 and 20. One of the two wheelsmen, a boy named Arthur Callaghan, was 16. I want you to hold that. He was 16. He had a mother. He had a home street in Kingston. He had a name written down, in a ledger somewhere, against the wages he had not yet been paid for the trip. He had whatever a 16-year-old has, a future imagined in fragments, a girl perhaps, a younger brother, a small pile of saved money in a tin under a bed somewhere. And on the night of the 21st of November, 1902, he was at the wheel of a ship in a snowstorm on Lake Superior. At noon that day, the captain of an upbound freighter called the Algonquin, a man named James McMore, sighted the Bannockburn through binoculars about 7 miles to his southeast. He recognized her. He had a steel-hulled, British-built ship of his own, similar in profile. He watched her for several minutes. The snow thickened. She was gone. He thought nothing of it. He assumed she had simply moved out of the visibility he had. That afternoon, the storm grew. By evening, snow drove across the lake in horizontal sheets. The wind reached gale strength. At 11 o'clock at night, the night watch crew of an upbound passenger steamer called the Huronic reported seeing the lights of a ship passing them in the storm. The pattern of those lights, they later said, looked like the Bannockburn. The two vessels passed in opposite directions and did not signal one another. The Huronic recorded it as a routine sighting. The journal of one of the Huronic's waiters, a man named Fred Landon, kept that night for himself, contained 2 entries. November 21st. At night we had the worst storm of the season. November 22nd. Engines of the Huronic damaged by storm. The Huronic survived. The Bannockburn did not. She was reported overdue at the Sulocks the next morning. After several more days, it became alarming. On the 25th of November, a steamer called the John D. Rockefeller passed through a field of floating debris near Stannard Rock Light. Her crew did not know what they were seeing. The Bannockburn had not yet been reported lost. They sailed on. By the 30th of November, she was officially given up. She'd carried 20 men. None of them were ever seen again. No bodies were ever recovered. Wrecking tugs, the Boynton and the Favourite, searched the north shore of Lake Superior for days and found nothing. There was a brief false hope on the 26th of November when L. Henderson, a manager of the Montreal Transportation Company, told a Fort William newspaper that the ship had been located on the north shore of Lake Superior opposite Michipicoten Island. Crew safe. He admitted later that he had based this on a rumor from another freighter, the Germanic. The Germanic had not seen her. She was nowhere near Michipicoten. She was on the bottom of Lake Superior, somewhere in the deepest cold fresh water on the continent, and she has been there ever since. On the 12th of December, 3 weeks after the storm, the captain of the life-saving station at Grand Marais, Michigan, found a single cork life preserver washed up on the beach. It was stenciled with the name Bannockburn. It is the only piece of her that has ever been recovered. It is the only piece of any of those 20 men that has ever been recovered. Arthur Callaghan is 16 years old in every record that mentions him, and he will be 16 forever because the lake never gave him back to be older. By the time the ice came in late December, the lakes were quiet again. The harbours froze. The schooners that had survived the year were tied up in their winter berths. In the offices on Water Street and Front Street, the accountants closed the books. Tonnage out, tonnage in, insurance paid, crews replaced. The numbers were acceptable. In Kingston, Ontario, a mother kept a 16-year-old's coat hanging on a peg by the door because she had not yet brought herself to take it down. The clerks in the lumber offices, and the underwriters in the insurance offices, and the owners in their parlours did not know her name. They had no reason to. The system that had killed her son, and 19 other men, and the men of the Bay City, and the men of the Wilson, and the men of every quiet, small wreck of that quiet, small year. That system was not, in 1902, considered to have done anything wrong. The lake had taken what the lake took. The cargo, in most cases, had been insured. That silence is the next chapter. The lake, behind the life-saving captain, holding the cork life-preserver in his gloved hands at Grand Marais, said nothing at all. It never does. There was no inquiry. That is the sentence to begin with. There was no inquiry into the loss of the Bannockburn. There was no inquiry into the loss of the Bay City. There was no inquiry into the loss of the Robert Wallace, the Dan Hayes, the Henry J. Johnson, or the men who went down with the Thomas Wilson in 3 minutes on a calm June morning. There was, in 1902, on the Great Lakes of North America, no body of law that required an inquiry. There were no laws that limited how deep a ship could be loaded. There were no laws that limited how old a hull could be before she was condemned. There were no laws that limited how young a deckhand could be hired. There were no laws that required an owner to keep his vessels off the water in November. There was the United States Steamboat Inspection Service, which had existed since 1871 and inspected steam-powered passenger vessels for boiler safety. There was a Canadian equivalent on the northern shore. There were marine underwriters who set their own private vessel ratings, a 1, a 2, B1, on which insurance premiums were calculated. There were the harbour masters, who could, in theory, refuse a vessel clearance from a port. In practice, they almost never did. That was all. This is the suppression. This is the silence. And it is, in the end, more frightening than any single wreck, because a wreck is an event, and an event ends, and a silence does not. There were, in fact, 2 layers of silence working at once. The first was structural. There was simply no law to enforce. The second was deliberate and quieter, and more difficult to see, because it operated in plain view of everyone and was not considered at the time to require concealment. Picture yourself in the office of a marine underwriter in Cleveland, Ohio, in the first week of December, 1902. The room is small, wood-panelled, a coal stove in the corner, a desk under a green-shaded lamp. On the desk is a ledger. The clerk is in his middle 40s. He has in front of him the policy file for the Bannockburn. The hull was insured. The cargo, 85,000 bushels of wheat, was insured separately by the buyer at the Georgian Bay terminal. The premiums had been paid. The clerk does not need to investigate why the ship sank. The lake sank her. The lake has, in the language of the policy itself, been declared an act of God. The act of God is covered. He writes the date. He stamps the file. He moves it to the outgoing tray. The next file on his desk is an application for hull insurance on a 16-year-old wooden lumber schooner being moved into the trade for the first time by a new owner out of a Wisconsin port. This is the sound of the system working as it was designed to work. Now picture the other office, the one in Muskegon on Western Avenue, where the firm of Hackley and Hume kept its books. By 1902, the mill itself had closed 8 years earlier. The forests of Michigan's Lower Peninsula had been cut to the ground, and there was simply no more pine to mill. But Charles Hackley, by then 65 years old, was still active. His estate was approaching what would, at his death in February 1905, be valued at roughly $18 million, about $600 million in today's money. His ships were still working, under various owners and various names. The C.H. Hackley was still hauling lumber from Manistee to Chicago. The Rouse Simmons, the future Christmas tree ship, was still on the lakes. She would not go down until 1912. The Thomas Hume, lost in 1891 with 7 men, had never been found. Hackley was, by the standards of the philanthropy of his day, an extraordinary man. He gave his city a public library, a hospital, an art gallery, parks, schools, an athletic field, a manual training college. His statue still sits on a bench in downtown Muskegon. His record of public giving is real and is publicly admired. None of this is in dispute. What is also, separately, true, and stands in the public record alongside the philanthropy, is that the men who built fortunes like Hackley's built them on the freight rates of fleets like Hackley's. And the freight rates depended on the use of the cheapest serviceable hulls available, loaded as deep as the captain dared, crewed by men paid as little as the trade would bear. In Muskegon, in Bay City, in Saginaw, in Manistee, in Marinette, the lumber barons and the men who insured them, and the men who set their freight rates, and the men who held the harbor commissions were, in many cases, the same men, or members of the same families, or close personal friends. This was not a conspiracy. A conspiracy would have required secrecy. There was no secrecy. The arrangement was open and obvious, and considered by the men inside it to be simply the way commerce functioned. The lumber industry of the upper Great Lakes was the most productive forestry operation in the world at that time. Michigan, between 1869 and 1900, was the leading lumber-producing state in the United States. The men who built that industry believed sincerely that the work they were doing was the work of building a nation. They were not wrong about that. The houses of Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, and Detroit in 1902 had been milled out of the pine forests of the upper lakes and carried south on these ships. The country, in a real sense, had been floated south on the schooners. But every nation built on cargo is also built on the men who carried it. And the men who carried the lumber in 1902 were carried often to the bottom. The records of how often this happened are scattered, but they are not hidden. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum estimates that across the long history of these waters, roughly 6,000 vessels have been lost, and roughly 30,000 lives have ended in this fresh, cold mineral water. The historian and mariner Mark Thompson, in his 2004 book, Graveyard of the Lakes, has argued that the true figure of total wrecks may be substantially higher, possibly more than 25,000, when small barges, scows, and unrecorded losses are added. By the early 1900s, on Lake Michigan alone, more than 2,000 sailing ships were registered at local ports. The Whitefish Point area of Lake Superior, by itself, has accounted for at least 240 wrecked ships between 1816 and 1975. Hold those numbers. 6,000 vessels, 30,000 lives, 2,000 sailing ships on a single lake, 240 wrecks at a single point of compass. These are not the numbers of accidents. Accidents are random and rare. These are the numbers of a system. They are what a system produces when it is permitted, year after year, to produce them without correction. What would a real safety report in 1902 have found? It would have found the green lumber loading practice, 6 and 8 and 10 feet of unseasoned pine stacked above an already full hold. It would have found the absence of any legal load line on the lakes. It would have found the use of crews aged 17 to 20, with 16-year-old wheelsmen on overnight watches in November weather. It would have found the towing of long strings of barges, old schooners stripped of their masts, lashed in line behind a single tug, sometimes 3 or 4 to a tow, on a single hawser, in open water, in autumn. It would have found that all of this was known, not suspected, known, by the captains who refused certain trips, by the older sailors who would not sign on after October, by the life-saving station crews who pulled the bodies out, by the harbour masters who watched the schooners depart, sitting 2 inches lower in the water than the law of any other shipping nation would have allowed, by the lumber-yard foremen who watched the green pine, still bleeding sap, being lashed onto a deck that was already full. What would such a report have changed? It would have changed the freight rates. It would have changed the ship design standards. It would have ended or limited the late-season trade. It would have cost the lumber barons and the shipping firms and the underwriters and the buyers real money. So the report was not written. It was not suppressed in the dramatic sense. There was no single document hidden in a drawer that a brave clerk later discovered. It was suppressed in a deeper sense, the more dangerous sense. It was suppressed by simply never being commissioned. By no one in the United States Congress or the Canadian Parliament, or the state legislatures of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, or Ontario, ever calling for it. The Bannockburn's biography, as it stands today in the public maritime record, states the matter directly. Shipping firms in this period had strong financial incentives and no legislative reason to crew their vessels with the youngest, least experienced sailors they could find. That is the form the suppression took. Not a cover-up, a vacuum. Vacuum that the families of the dead boys could not fill because they had no lawyers and the boys had no votes, and the lake, as the policies said, was an act of God. Picture yourself now in the chamber of a state legislature in Lansing, Michigan, in early 1903. 3 months have passed since the Bannockburn went down. The bell at the Sioux locks no longer rings for her. There are men in this chamber who are themselves lumbermen, or sons of lumbermen, or attorneys for lumbermen. There are men in this chamber whose campaign expenses last election were paid by the very firms whose vessels are at the bottom of Lake Superior. Charles Hackley himself had served in earlier years as county treasurer, as a member of the Common Council, as a member of the Muskegon Board of Public Works. The lumber industry was not separate from the political class of the lumber states. The lumber industry, in many cases, was the political class. The session opens. There are bills on the docket. There are roads to be funded, schools to be approved, taxes to be debated. The wrecks of 1902 are not on the docket. The wrecks of 1902 are not on any docket. They are, instead, on the bottom of the lakes, where they will remain. This is what is meant, in the title of this video, by the suppression of the truth of the 1902 wrecks. The truth was not a paper. The truth was a system. The system was not concealed. The system was simply not asked about. It operated in plain view of the men who profited from it, and it operated in plain view of the men who died inside it, and it operated, in the end, in plain view of all of us, in the marine records, in the newspaper morgue files, in the life-saving station logs, in the insurance ledgers, all of which still exist, all of which can still be read, all of which were never collected into a single document because no one in a position of authority, in 1902 or in 1903, or for many years afterward, ever wanted them to be. The question was, should this hull be on the water at all? The answer, in 1902, was decided not by a regulator and not by an inspector. It was decided by a freight rate. The freight rate said yes. The hull went out. In a great many cases, too many to name, the hull did not come back. The lake does not forget. Everything else has gone. The lumber barons are dead. Charles Hackley died in February 1905, 3 years after the wrecks of this story, and was buried in Muskegon. The captains are dead. The owners and the underwriters and the clerks who wrote the manifests are dead. The mills at Alpena and Manistique and Bay City have been torn down or burned or fallen in. The pine forests they fed on were cut, in most cases, beyond recovery. The schooner Bay City has been on the bottom of Thunder Bay for 123 years. The boy Arthur Callaghan, who was 16 years old at the wheel of the Bannockburn on the night of the 21st of November, 1902, has been on the bottom of Lake Superior for the same length of time. The widow in Kingston, Ontario, who kept his coat on a peg by the door, has been dead for many decades, and the house is, in all likelihood, no longer standing. But the lake remembers. Picture yourself now in a small boat on Lake Huron on a calm September afternoon. The water is the color of weak tea over white stone. The air is still. The sun is high. You are above the wreck of a 3-masted schooner called the Cornelia B. Windiate. She was lost in November 1875, 27 years before the wrecks I have been telling you about, in similar circumstances. A hold full of grain, a late-season storm, no survivors, no recovered bodies. She was found in 1986. She is 185 feet down. She is almost perfectly intact. The cold, fresh, oxygen-poor water of the upper Great Lakes preserves a wooden hull in ways that no ocean ever could. There are no wood-eating organisms here. The temperature, 400 feet down, sits within a few degrees of freezing, summer and winter alike, year after year, century after century. The wood does not rot. The iron does not corrode at the rate it would in salt water. What the lake takes, the lake keeps almost exactly as it was. When divers from the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary first reached the Windiate and turned their lights on her, what they saw in the cone of those lights was a ship. Not a wreck, a ship. All 3 of her masts were still standing. Her rigging, in places, was still attached. Her cargo of grain was still stowed in her hold. Her yawl boat, her lifeboat, was still hanging in its davits at the stern beside the ship, because none of her crew had ever made it to the boat. They had not even had time to lower it. She is a time capsule. She is what every single one of the wrecks of 1902, the Bay City, the Bannockburn, the Robert Wallace, the Dan Hayes, the Henry J. Johnson, the small lumber schooners that did not make the front pages, almost certainly looks like, right now, today, on the bottoms of the lakes that took them. The Robert Wallace, the wooden bulk freighter lost on Lake Superior in 1902, was found by sonar more than a century later in 235 feet of water. Her bronze bell was still attached to a wooden rail and engraved with her name. The Bannockburn has not been found. She is one of the most sought-after undiscovered wrecks on the Great Lakes. Sonar surveys have been conducted in her likely area of loss for more than a century. She has not been raised on any screen. The lake is very large and very deep and very dark. Lake Superior averages 500 feet in depth and reaches 1,332 feet at her deepest point. She will be found eventually. Sonar improves every year. The lake is patient, but it is not infinite. When she is found, she will, almost certainly, look very much the way she looked on the night of the 21st of November, 1902. Her holds still loaded with 85,000 bushels of wheat. Her cabin doors still on their hinges. Her ship's bell still in its housing. Her name, stenciled in raised iron letters on her stern, still legible. Bannockburn. And her crew, Captain George R. Wood of Port Dalhousie, First Mate Alex Graham, Chief Engineer George Booth of Kingston, the boy Arthur Callaghan, and the other 16, in some configuration, still aboard her, where they were when she went down. This is what is meant, in the end, by the lake remembering. Picture yourself, one last time, walking the beach near Grand Marais, Michigan, on a December afternoon. The lake to your left, the dunes to your right, the wind from the north, your boots in the wet sand. There are gulls, there is driftwood, there is the long, low sound of the surf, Lake Superior's surf, which is its own thing, slower and heavier than any ocean, the way a great cold animal turns in its sleep. This is the beach where, on the 12th of December, 1902, the captain of the life-saving station bent down and picked up a single cork life preserver. It was wet. It was heavy. It was stenciled with the name Bannockburn. It is the only piece of that ship and the only piece of those 20 men that the lake has ever returned. It rests now in a museum collection. You could, if you wished, go and look at it. You would not be reading the name of a ship. You would be reading the name of an arrangement between owners and captains and underwriters and freight rates and absent law and present greed. That put 20 men, most of them teenagers, into the dark water on a night when older men had already refused the trip. There are questions, at the end of a story like this one, that a documentary is supposed to ask. They are not questions that have answers. They are questions that are asked because asking them is the only honest way to close. Where are they now? The men who built the lumber empires of the upper Great Lakes are buried in cemeteries in Muskegon and Saginaw and Bay City and Cleveland. Their graves are large. Their names are still, in some cases, on the foundations of buildings in the cities they helped to build. The libraries Charles Hackley built still stand. His statue still sits on its bench in downtown Muskegon. The lumber barons, in death, have done well. The men they sent into the lake have not. Crew lists for the small lumber schooners of 1902 are, in many cases, lost. The harbor port shipping registers in Wisconsin and Michigan and Ontario have gaps. Deckhands who signed on for a single voyage and did not come back were not always recorded by full name. Sometimes only by a first name, sometimes only by an initial, sometimes only by a wage entry. Deckhand, paid $2 at signing. Balance unpaid, lost at sea. Arthur Callaghan is named because the Bannockburn's record was unusually thorough. Many of his fellows were not named at all. Does anyone remember their names? There is a building on Whitefish Point on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan called the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. It sits beside one of the oldest lighthouses on Lake Superior. Inside it, in glass cases, are the recovered objects from 100 wrecks. Smaller objects, too. A sailor's pipe, a leather wallet, a coin purse, a watch that stopped at the moment its owner went into the water. The museum keeps the names. The museum reads them, on certain anniversaries, into a public address system beside the lighthouse, while the families who still come up to that point listen. The names of the Bannockburn's men are read there. The name of Arthur Callaghan is read there. He has been 16 years old for 123 years, and once a year, on a cold afternoon in November, on a shoreline 400 miles from the city where his mother once kept his coat on a peg by the door, his name is spoken out loud into the wind off the lake. It is not enough. It is something. The schooners are down there, in the cold and the dark, with their cargoes still in their holds. The system that put them there has been gone for 100 years. The records of what it did are public and have always been public. The story has not been hidden. The story has been waiting. The lake remembers. The lake is the only thing that does.